today I am going to continue my discussion on what is politics. This is the third part of our discussion on this theme, in which we have already touched upon a number of issues in the first two parts. For example, theorizing the political, and also the expansion of political little bit we had discussed in earlier lecture, but that remained inconclusive. What I intend to do today in course of my discussion, that this entire idea of politics, the way it was visualized at the dawn of modernity. For example, we had discussed earlier that how through revolutions, particularly 17th and 18th century, this entire idea of politics got reimagined, and accordingly it also got expanded. And how different thinkers and different events in history have contributed to this expansion of the idea of political. In fact, we looked at that issue in our earlier lectures. But today, in fact, I will just pick up the thread where I had left earlier. For example, I had divided these three lectures on what is politics into three different sub themes, like theorizing the political, expansion of the idea of political, and problematization of the idea of political. So, in fact, the first part, that is theorizing the political, in fact we had discussed in the first two lectures extensively, that how this idea of political was theorized, how this idea of politics as an activity and political as a sphere of that activity got interrelated, or in fact were interrelated from the very beginning, but how they were reimagined from time to time. But this theorizing the political, in fact, we were discussing in our last lecture about the three different contestations or three different positions on this issue, that what is politics, and I had put it in terms of the power view, the liberal view, and the Marxist view, and the power view we were discussing in our last lecture. So today what I intend to do, that first of all I will basically complete my discussion or wind up my discussion on these three views on politics, that is power, liberal, and Marxist, and then I will look at two different set of issues. One is expansion of this idea of political, and then also problematization of the idea of political. So far as this expansion of the idea of political, I will be essentially looking at three important developments in modern time, particularly how the workers movement, the trade union movement, and other similar movements, along with the ideological within the ideological framework of socialism, expanded this entire notion of political in modern time. And then of course the ascendancy and the rise of the feminist politics and the feminist theory has further expanded this idea. So along with this workers movement, feminism contributed to great extent toward this expansion, along with this entire green theory, or environmentalism as it is called in political theory. So three important developments so far as the expansion of the idea of political is concerned should be taken into consideration. So I will be touching upon these three important discourses, and then finally I will conclude my discussion with the problematization of political, that not only expansion but side by side the problematization has also happened in the late 20th and the early 21st century, particularly associated with the theories like postmodernism, multiculturalism, and neoliberalism. They have problematized this issue of politics. They have put new poses, they have put new questions, they have brought new issues on the table for discussion, and therefore they have completely changed our understanding of politics, from cyber politics to biopolitics to number of issues. In fact, we have seen in recent years and recent decades. So I will be basically winding up this entire discussion on this note, that how this problematization is happening through three interventions: postmodernist, the multicultural, and as well as the neoliberal. So this is how I plan to go about. But let us start with this three important positions on what is politics and power view. In fact, we had discussed in our earlier lecture that what is power, and I had mentioned in my earlier discussion that there is no disagreement that what is power, because it is generally believed that the capacity of A to control the behavior of the B is the power equation between A and B. But how one gets this capacity has been a matter of debate and has acquired ideological overtones over the years, particularly between two ideological camps, the liberals and the Marxists. Now at the same time, in fact, what are the main motives of men and women in society which pull them to social activity, which is normally we understand as politics, has also been a matter of debate. And here in fact we should remember that from very beginning, particularly since 17th century, since the days of Thomas Hobbes, the famous social contract theorist of 17th century, this matter has been debated. For example, for Hobbes, the entire thing is related to the power, the quest for power, or fear of life, loss of life, which compelled people to political activity, that is politics. And this is how he perhaps imagined a contractual basis for the state power, state institution, or state authority. Then of course in 18th century we had a different type of imagination with utilitarianism, particularly the way Bentham looked at it. He declared pleasure as the most driving, the driving force of human activity. So therefore in fact there have been number of positions, number of explanations that what pull human beings to this activity, politics. But one thing we should also remember that when we discuss the power view of politics, and this I briefly touched upon in my earlier lecture also, that there are three different set of issues which are normally discussed. Location of power, that where power is located. If there is not much disagreement that what is power, as I mentioned, that capacity of A to control the behavior of B is a power relationship. Normally people say that this is how we should understand power. But the thing is the location of power, where power is located. And here in fact a lot of differences come up. For example, the three important positions which can be identified here is one statist, another is pluralist, then you have elitist, and of course the Marxist. So statist, pluralist and elitist, broadly they operate within the liberal framework, whereas the Marxism takes altogether different position on all these issues. So therefore location of power is important. Now the next is the nature of power. What is the nature of this? What is the nature of power? Whether power is something which is in the interest of human beings, in the interest of society, or should we suspect power? Should we checkmate power? And liberalism here comes in a big way. Within liberalism, of course, there are a number of traditions, but the dominant tradition from the very beginning has been suspicious of power, and therefore Acton's famous statement that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely basically is a very good reminder that how liberal tradition has been looking at power. So far as the idealist tradition is concerned, they have always glorified power. Marxism, of course, looks at power in terms of class relations, that ultimately depends on what is the nature of power, who is wielding power, and particularly in a class divided capitalist society, power is always used by the dominant class, the ruling class, to coerce the subordinate, the dominated. So therefore Marxism looks at this question from class perspective. But anarchism and other traditions have always been very suspicious of power. They believe that authority, power, freedom, they are they cannot be harmonized. So therefore location of power, nature of power, two things are important here. Of course on location of power, as I mentioned, that the pluralists and elitists have been debating this issue in recent years, that where the power lies. The pluralists say that there is not one agency in society which is the custodian of power, or where one can locate power. Power is rather dispersed in society among various associations, various societal groups. On the other hand, the elitist theory believes that power is always in possession of the elites in society, and they rule, and it is always and this is also not only a reality, but this is also a possibility, because only the elites have the capacity to rule. So therefore this debate between pluralist and elitist is already there. Of course I don't have to go into the detail of this debate. So after this location of power, the nature of power, nature of power, as I mentioned, the liberals from the very beginning have been very suspicious. There was little bit change later with the birth of the welfare state, when they started associating some positive connotation to state power, that power of the state can also use for societal good. But that trend has again been reversed with the birth of neoliberalism and neo-right ideologies within liberalism, who have basically revived the old classical dictum that the best government is which governs the least. So therefore what we find that there is complete revival of the classical mistrust about power, authority and state institutions. So far as the Marxism is concerned, I have already mentioned that they look at power in terms of the class division in society. Now the types of power is important. There are three different types of power: the political power, the economic power, and ideological power. And what we should understand, what we should keep in mind here, that the power, power theorists who are basically looking at this entire issue from the point of view of power, that ultimately politics' main preoccupation is distribution of power, allocation of power, acquisition of power. For example, Laswell's famous statement that who gets what is ultimate mission of politics, an analysis of politics. So ultimately political power is their main reference point, not the economic and ideological power. In fact, ideological power they reduce to socialization and other sociological categories, but the political power is perhaps their central thrust so far as their argument, their analysis is concerned. And political power for these power theorists, in fact, it is autonomous and neutral category, because it is neither to be reduced to the economic structure, nor it can be associated with other spheres of society. They enjoy some sort of autonomy, and they should be looked at, they should be analyzed at their own. On the other hand, what we find that the liberals, particularly liberals as a school of thought which is not very homogeneous, in fact they are divided between two types of scholars, two types of traditions: republicanism versus federalism, debate so far as the nature of sovereignty, the nature of state authority, and these things are concerned. For example, federalism and the entire federal discourse on this power, political power, is basically to be understood in terms of the American political tradition, the way they invented a new state craft, the new state institutions, and new theory of state power, in opposition to the Westphalian model, which was prevalent since 17th century in Europe. So therefore, this republican tradition, which is mostly associated with the French Revolution, and the federal tradition, which is mostly associated with the American War of Independence, or the American tradition in politics, they have looked at political power differently. Federal theory divides it into number of institutions, particularly the central and the regional institutions. They try to checkmate power with power through separation of power and other theory. On the other hand, the republicanism has a different take. They basically on the one hand, at the top they look at the state as the custodian of power, and at the bottom the people and its general will as particularly the only source, only loci of power. So therefore, the relationship between the state authority and the general will is perhaps the hallmark of this republican tradition. Now of course, as I mentioned, that for Marx and Marxist tradition, political power is essentially a class power. Whosoever is a dominant class in society wield political power, so they are not keen to give any autonomy to political power the way perhaps political power theorists would like to assign. So therefore, this is how in fact we have to see that the three types of power: political power, economic power, and ideological power. The first, the political power, is essentially associated with the power theorists who give lot of importance to it. The Marxists don't attach much importance. For example, the Mao's famous statement, the power flows from the barrels of the gun, and the classical Marxist position that ultimate power lies in the economic structure of society. Whosoever controls the means of production will have control on political institutions, and this is how they look at the state power as well. Now after this political power, there is economic power, and power view, of course, as I mentioned, the power theorists don't give much importance to economic power, because they feel that political power is a neutral, autonomous category. It cannot be reduced to economic structure, unlike the Marxist tradition. So here we find that on economic power, the Marxist tradition lays lot of emphasis, but the liberals, on the other hand, they feel that economic power is quite dispersed in society. There is not one class which has control on the economic system, and therefore they completely try to puncture this entire argument given by the Marxist tradition. For example, in fact, Barnum and many others, United States of America, when they talked of managerial revolution, and when they said that there is a complete separation of power economic power, political power, organizational power. There are different sources of power. So therefore, this entire argument that economic power is essentially located in the managers, or one can say the owners of capital, is a basically flawed position so far as their argument is concerned. For example, entire argument of C. Wright Mills about power elites, that there is not one type of elite in society, but there are multiple elites, elites from in economic structure, elites in the political structure, elites in social structure, and they all become the political elites. So therefore, they would not agree that there is only one source of economic power, or economic power lies in hands of few people who control the political power, the way perhaps the Marxist tradition would argue. So therefore, what we find that the power view of politics, when you look at the power view of politics, the first they believe that politics is essentially the control, management and distribution of power. Now location of power we have already seen. Then they say that nature of power, then of course there is a division, and as I mentioned, the pure power theorist would never associate power with any structure. They rather would like to give autonomy and neutrality to this political power. Economic power is essentially discussed and privileged in the analysis of the Marxist scholars and Marxist thinkers. The liberals, they believe that this entire Marxist argument is flawed because power is dispersed in society, and therefore I mentioned just now the concept of managerial revolution, which has revolutionized the entire structure of power, location and distribution in advanced capitalist societies. And here in fact, as I mentioned, the concept of power elites of C. Wright Mills is the best example of it. Now next is perhaps the ideological power, and it is here again we find that the power view deals with this ideological power in terms of socialization, political culture, legitimacy of political power, and this is how they look at this ideological power. So ultimately for them these things are important, that how ideological power leads to socialization of people, how socialization of people takes place through number of civil society institutions, how political culture is built, and how the legitimacy is granted or attained by political authority. So this is their entry point. But the Marxists in fact have been debating this ideological power in a big way, and for the liberals, as I mentioned, that entire Weberian discourse is perhaps their guiding principle. When Weber made a distinction between three different types of authority, charismatic, traditional and legal rational, and also the relationship between authority and legitimacy. And the way Weber looked at politics, in my earlier lecture I had talked about his two lectures, politics as vocation and science as vocation, on how he was keen to give politics as an activity some amount of autonomy compared to other activities. So therefore for liberals this entire Weberian take on these issues becomes very important. But the Marxist tradition or Marxist theory has extensively discussed this ideological power. In recent years, particularly in the post-Marxian tradition, particularly in 20th century, Marxist thinkers like Althusser, Gramsci, and even subsequently through debates on the nature of state power, particularly the relative autonomy of a state, between two Marxist thinkers, two scholars, for example Polonzas and Miliband, the way they debated relative autonomy of a state, we have seen that this entire question of ideological power has come very prominently into discourse in political theory and political science. So therefore we find that this ideological power has essentially been privileged in the discourse by the Marxist tradition, unlike the liberals or pure power theorists, as I put it, in terms of their commitment to political power. Now this Gramscian concept of hegemony is a very important concept so far as this ideological power is concerned, because Gramsci's entire query that how ruling class rules, does ruling class rule only through coercion, or does it rule through generation of consent, and if the consent is generated, then what is the process of this consent generation in society? And here he makes a very interesting distinction between political society and civil society, and civil society as a site for consent generation. And state possesses both type of activities, the coercive and the legitimacy of functions, the consent generation function. So therefore Gramsci's entire argument is quite nuanced, and over the years he has influenced a whole host of scholars within Marxist tradition to take this idea further so far as this ideological power is concerned. Apart from Gramsci, we also have Althusser, particularly the French structuralist thinker, who in fact looked at entire issue of ideological state apparatus, that how ideological state apparatus plays important role in terms of generation of these ideological resources for the ruling class to attain legitimacy, and how they succeed in basically generating consent among people. These ideological state apparatuses include churches, schools, clubs, and many other institutions. So in Althusser also we have very nuanced and extensive discussion of this ideological power. What I mean to say that this ideological power has essentially been debated, has been extensively theorized by the Marxist scholars, thinkers, and theorists, not the liberals, because they have reduced it to political socialization, political culture, authority, legitimacy, and so on and so forth. In recent times we have seen that a different type of discourse has emerged on this ideological power, and here it has come from two important and eminent thinkers of 20th century, Michel Foucault and Stephen Lukes, particularly the way they have looked at this power, particularly Foucault, who not only ideological power, that the multi-dimensional nature of power in advanced in this modern society. The way Foucault has looked at this issue, problematized this issue in terms of the nature of micro power, the biopolitics, how mind-body relationship, the knowledge power trade-off and the relationship, all these issues, the way he has theorized in recent decades, particularly towards the end of the 20th century, has set a new benchmark for the discussion of this power, power as an element in human life as well as element in human society. We will be looking at this issue, and particularly Foucaultian intervention later, when we will take up this issue of problematization of the idea of political after looking at this expansion of the idea of political. So therefore, in fact, this is how we have to look at this ideological nature of power. Apart from Foucault, I have also mentioned Stephen Lukes, the way he had talked about three dimensions of power as a domination through control. So therefore, in fact, Lukes and Foucault's contribution are very significant so far as understanding of the power view of politics is concerned, in spite of not being pure power theories the way perhaps we look at them, but nonetheless their contributions are quite significant. There are many criticisms of this power view. Liberals say that this entire resolution of conflict not only is the mission of politics, not only acquisition of power the way perhaps the power view would like us to believe. Then there is a normative criticism that the power view looks at it as a value neutral theory, which is not true. The Marxists would say that power view completely ignores the economic roots of power. So therefore, these are the criticisms coming from different ideological traditions. Then comes the liberal view on this on this politics. After power view, the second important theorization is liberal view, theorization of this idea of political. Now, liberal view looks at this politics in terms of two different positions, two different perspectives. The first, they look at politics as a mechanism to mediate and resolve conflict in society, and they believe that by very nature society and by very nature human beings are conflict ridden, because they are born to create conflicts, and therefore what happens that you need some agency, some sort of mechanism like politics to mediate and resolve those conflicts. And what is the nature of society which gives birth to such conflicts? This is something to be understood with reference to all the liberal thinkers since 16th century, the way they have presented this entire society, starting with Machiavelli, who made a statement like this, that human beings can forget even the death of their father, but they cannot forget the confiscation of property. That statement shows that what type of character and nature human beings possess. And coming to the social contract theorists, as I have already mentioned, Hobbes and others, the way they painted this entire picture, that fear of loss of life, the quest for power, and all these things bring them together. So this negative presentation of the human nature, and therefore the necessity for some mechanism like politics, is the hallmark of the liberal view so far as the politics is concerned. But then at the same time, apart from this mediating the conflict and resolving the conflict and politics as an agency to do that, there is another parallel view also which emerged gradually with the emergence of the positive liberalism and the concept of positive state, which later on graduated to the concept of welfare state. Here it is to serve the common good or the general interest of society, that it is not simply to mediate the conflicts in society, but rather it is also to promote the common good of people. It is also there to serve the general interest of society, and here they basically associate politics with the state power and state institutions, because state in their opinion is above these conflicts, and a state is beyond these narrow interests. They only try to promote common interest and the common good. So therefore this concept of welfare state is a very important theoretical innovation so far as the liberal tradition or liberal take on politics is concerned. Here I am also reminded of one thing, that liberals as a whole normally they have a very statist orientation towards politics. They normally locate politics in the sphere of state institutions and state power. For example, Easton, in 20th century, a system theorist, a structural functionalist, the way he defined politics as authoritative allocation of values, that there are three components of this statement: authoritative allocation of values, that values allocation of values by those who have authority to allocate can only be called politics. And as it is well known that for liberals the authority, the power becomes authority only when it gains legitimacy. And how it gains legitimacy, there is a elaborate process in liberal democratic tradition for gaining and attaining this legitimacy. But one thing is very clear, that in society authority lies only with the state personnel. So therefore their actions only constitute politics. The civil society part, the societal part, does not figure prominently in their scheme of things so far as politics is concerned. Of course, in the system theory, when they talk of system, there is a process of feedback mechanism. In that feedback mechanism, we find that demand, support, and many other things, because the society ultimately becomes the channel for both demand and support, and therefore this feedback mechanism through which the different type of functions are performed by the system, from rule making to rule application to rule adjudication, and then ultimately again comes back to society. So therefore this system theory looks at this issue within its own framework of structural functionalism. But nonetheless, one thing is very clear, that this definition of politics by Easton as authoritative allocation of values is a clear signal that where they locate politics they locate within the state institutions, because authoritative means those who have authority, and if they allocate values, that can only be considered politics, and authority normally lies with those who are associated with the state institutions. So therefore what I was trying to mentioned there, that liberal tradition as a whole has been locating and associating politics with the state institutions. They have been locating in the domain of state. Of course, they talk of parapolitics, they talk of certain other brands of politics emanating from civil society, but nonetheless this is the dominant position so far as the liberal view is concerned. So therefore, in fact, to conclude this part, that is liberal view on politics, they have two different positions. One, the politics as a mechanism to mediate conflicting interests in society. Why the conflicts arise? Because of nature of society and nature of human beings. And as I have mentioned, that all liberal thinkers from the very beginning, with some exception, have been painting human nature in this shape, that is, that they are basically bound to conflict with each other, they cannot live in harmony, and therefore you need some agency like politics. And then the parallel view that politics is also meant it should be seen as an agency to serve common good or the general interest of society through the concept of welfare state and so on and so forth. So that basically brings me to the third view on politics, that is a Marxian view of politics after power view and the liberal view. Now, what Marxist theory looks at politics, and I have mentioned it earlier also, that for Marxism, politics is to be seen essentially as part of the class struggle, and society for the Marxist theory is the main site of politics, not the state, because for them state power is nothing but the reflection of the class power. And here we should remember the base superstructure analysis made by the Marxist theory to understand entire society and social formation, and how politics remains the part of the superstructure. The base, the economic structure, is perhaps the determining factor in this entire analysis. So therefore, their understanding of politics is very simple. But one thing which we find that over the years there has been a very intense debate among Marxist scholars on the nature of state power. That what is the nature of state power in capitalist society and the socialist society. But the socialist society part, of course, is a very complicated part, because they believe that a state will wither away. There will be no need for state institutions in socialist society. But after the Bolshevik revolution, we find that the Soviet state, instead of withering away, became very powerful as any other capitalist society. So therefore, a debate ensued about the nature of state power in the post-revolutionary society, and that debate has been going on. But one thing is very important here to remember, that even in capitalist society, they have discussed the nature of a state in recent years and decades. Particularly the two important schools within Marxist theory, the instrumentalist and the structuralist school, they have debated this issue, that is on the question of relative autonomy of the state, because Marxist theory normally would not give any autonomy to a state, because they would say that a state is ultimately the managing committee of the bourgeoisie, as Marx stated in his Communist Manifesto. But this debate among scholars of Marxist school of thought, that whether a state enjoys some autonomy or not, or even if can we grant relative autonomy to a state or not, or should we simply see in it as an instrument of the ruling class. This matter was debated extensively by Miliband and Polonjaz. Polonjaz arguing for a state relative autonomy, and the Miliband taking an instrumentalist position. Polonjaz in fact went to the extent of declaring that a state sometimes becomes the arena of class struggle, and it is here we find a very important shift, that from the civil society, the societal realm, this entire class struggle is shifted to the state arena, and thereby making a state a very important site for politics, which is very uncommon within the Marxist tradition. So therefore, this is how we have to look at the Marxist theory of politics. After looking at this Marxist theory, the power view, the liberal view and the Marxist view, the next issue I want to take up is the expansion of this idea of political. That this first part was the theorizing the political, and this theorizing the political we have seen started in 16th century with revolutions, and then we find that this continued, this tradition, after it acquired some ideological overtone, after it got divided into different ideological traditions, the liberal, the Marxist, the idealist, the anarchist, and so on and so forth. And within liberalism itself we have seen number of differentiation taking place on number of issues. But this is how the idea of politics and political were conceived. But after this theorization part was more or less done, then we find that suddenly we discover that side by side, not suddenly but rather we all discover that side by side the expansion of this idea of political was also taking place. Just to remind the listeners that in our earlier lecture we had seen that how in ancient time the Greek city-state to ancient Indian thinkers like Kautilya or the medieval thinkers like Aquinas and others, in fact the idea of politics was very restrictive, and then gradually it got expanded with the advent of democracy. But that was the first moment so far as the expansion of political is concerned, and the birth of democracy, birth of modernity, and the revolutions of 16th, 17th and 18th century, particularly 17th and 18th century, led to this expansion. But in the particularly in what we find the late in 20th century, we find this expansion of this idea of political, because we have already defined it, the political and politics as an activity and political as a domain for that activity or a sphere of that activity, were reimagined and also re-theorized, and and side by side it also got expanded. And this expansion happened on account of 3-4 important interventions or 3-4 important agencies getting incorporated in this domain. And it is here that we should remember the contribution of trade union movement, the workers movement in the world, the feminist movement, movement of of the colored people, the slaves, the blacks United States of America, the decolonization of the third world countries, and number of other issues which were raised by the social movements. For example, environmental issues, the issues of animal rights, the issues of similar many other issues which were raised. So what happened that in the earlier expansion of this idea of political had happened through revolution, in 20th century and 21st century we find this expansion took place through social movements, the feminist movements, the trade union movement, the green movement, the animal rights movement, and so on and so forth. So therefore this was perhaps the high point in terms of the expansion of this idea of political. Of course, along with this idea of expansion of political, we find that the problematization of this political has also happened, where some important questions have been posed, that how far this politics as an activity is capable enough to liberate human beings, which was perhaps basically done earlier. Politics was assigned a very important role for human liberation and emancipation in modern time. But in 21st century and the end of 20th century, we find that new projects were made, particularly by the postmodernist theory and similar other developments which started questioning the capability or capacity of politics to emancipate human beings, with the new challenges staring in our face when they talked of postmodern political condition, as a famous postmodernist thinker Lyotard called it. So therefore we find that this expansion and problematization are the new aspects of our intellectual life today, and political theory is seized of this matter in a big way, be it biopolitics or the cyber politics or the neoliberal politics of 21st century. So this is how we have to look at these two issues: expansion of the idea of political and problematization of the idea of political. To begin with this expansion, as I mentioned that earlier this idea of political got expanded through revolution, but in late 20th and 21st century it basically got expanded with through social movements. And therefore what we find that be it socialism or the trade union movement or the feminist movements, they are basically the product of social movements. So therefore these three important types of expansion, or one can say intervention so far as the expansion of the idea of political is concerned. And let's discuss what are they. The first is the socialism and the trade union movement, and it is here we should remember that how socialism as an ideology started coming to the fore in 19th century and 20th century, with a number of with different hues and different descriptions, from feminism to evolutionary socialism to democratic socialism to Marxian socialism to utopian socialism and so on and so forth. Now, with that, what we also find that a powerful trade union movement started in those countries which had witnessed industrialization and urbanization, and along with this arrival of a new class on the political horizon, the class of the workers, and also an organization called trade union movements. Trade unions, organization of these workers, was a very powerful intervention in terms of this expansion of this idea of political was concerned. And this entire idea or issue of this citizenship got re-theorized and reimagined, and it is here we should remember the contribution of Marshall, who has theorized this citizenship with reference to different moments of expansion, and this is also one important moment when these workers brought new issues on this table so far as citizenship theory is concerned. So therefore the frontier of politics got expanded. The next intervention was feminism, and it is here we should remember the suffrage movement, particularly the quest for political participation and political representation. This is what the suffragettes demanded, and then from the suffrage movement, entire feminism broke new frontiers. In fact, they opened new frontiers by giving the slogan like personal is political, that politics of everyday life and the lived experience. They talked of standpoint epistemology, and of course feminism has moved through different waves, the first wave, the second wave and the third wave. The first was the liberal feminism when they talked of sameness. The second wave was the liberal component, but not only of political reform but of social change, and the third wave was the politics of difference and intersectionality. So therefore liberal feminism, socialist feminism, radical feminism, postmodern feminism, these are ecofeminism, these are different brands of feminism. Of course we will be discussing sometime later under the broad heading of feminism. Then the third expansion was through ecologism. An entire slogan of ecocentrism against anthropocentrism. They said that ecological balance, rather achievement of human ends should be the mission. Anthropocentrism has ruined ecology. No, they argued for applying moral values and standards developed in relation to human species to the other species as well, like animal rights. And accordingly, the entire theory of post-materialism and green theories emerged, which attacked consumerism as they thought that this was leading to environmental degradation. In fact, Gandhi's critique of modern civilization, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Erich Fromm's famous statement that having attitude of mind is the basis of this materialist worldview. All these things are part of this entire quest for extending this frontier of politics to inanimate things like nature, and therefore this quest for happiness index and associating with the development discourse was another important dimension of this theory. So this was another expansion. Now last thing is the problematization of this political. After theorizing the political and its expansion over the ages, today we are encountering a new problematization of the idea and the domain of political through some new churnings, and they are: number one, postmodernism. Because as I mentioned earlier also, the postmodernism has, along with expanding this frontier through concepts like biopolitics and cyber politics, they have also brought new issues into the discussion, where they have raised serious questions on the ability of politics to transform society, because the nature of the changes which have taken place in society, which they call postmodern political condition, as I mentioned Lyotard's famous statement. And here the contribution of Michel Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, Chantal Mouffe and many others are very important, because they argue that the conditions under which politics today operates have changed, and therefore these conditions are not appropriate or conducive for politics understood in traditional conventional sense to make changes. They talk of micropolitics and the new mechanics of power in society. For example, they believe that body has become the site of contestation and operation. This is what they mean by biopolitics. The kind of association, the relationship they establish between power and knowledge in a discursive frame of modernity is something very important to understand this limitation of politics in today's world. Anti-foundationalism, attack on meta-narrative and relativity of truth, that there is no one truth. Today we hear about the post-truth society, but the postmodernists basically highlighted this relativism of truth, that truth is relative, and since there is no one truth, therefore the politics faces an inherent limitation to deal with this question of social change and social transformation. So therefore there is no identity is in a flux, and Mufre's concept of rainbow coalition for social transformation, all these arguments are part of this process. Then the next problematization has happened due to multiculturalism within liberalism, where they talk of culture and identity and also the politics of recognition. They have critiqued the earlier notion of liberal mind about unencumbered self, that self is totally unencumbered. They try to look at self as a situated self, and therefore they have raised new issues in terms of the traditional understanding of politics and its limitation, the way they talk of diversity and the difference, blindness of liberal theory. And finally, this neoliberalism with the new understanding of politics outside the domain of a state and locating it within the market and civil society, the way they have glorified the local in this era of globalization, is another high point of this problematization. So these three ways through which it has been problematized apart from expansion. So this is how we have to understand this entire idea of political and the how to understand politics. So I will basically conclude on this note.